Okay, so I was just reading a comment of a video I posted of the spike actually, and a person, I don't know if they'll be watching this, made a comment like asked me about my crank length, which I've been using 160 millimeter cranks, and I've been using short cranks of varying lengths since 2017. I want to credit Kenneth Lowe as the inspiration for it because he's he's a shorter Asian bro like myself, but it all goes to research that Jim Martin, another friend of mine, has done. And here's the thing, why I use short cranks and why now it's so popular is a thing called hip impingement. And this person had, going back to the original thing about the person making a comment of, I asked me what my crank length was, and so I explained I experimented with different varying lengths until I no longer had felt hip impingement, but still long enough where it didn't hamper my standing start, which is my bread and butter. And what I mean by that is I went shorter and shorter and shorter, and then increased the length until I started feeling hip impingement. So now I keep on saying hip impingement. The thing is most people don't know what hip impingement is. And the person made a comment, it's like, well, you shouldn't have experimented, you should use a qualified bike fitter. And which kind of makes sense, but here's the rub, is that most bike fitters aren't going to have the capacity or the ability to, or the patience or the time or the money to have adjustable cranks for you to experiment with under supervision. And as experienced as a bike rider as I am, a competitive bike rider might I add, I have the time and the mechanical ability and the wherewithal to experiment myself and know to not hurt myself. That said, everyone should get a bike fit because they are very, very important. But getting one twice a year is completely impractical. Annually is ideal, but still impractical. But you should get one every few years for sure because things happen morphologically. But back to my hip impingement part, I digress. What hip impingement is when you feel your hip being bound up when you're bent over. And technically, you don't have to be bent over. In some extreme cases, you could have hip impingement at a very shallow angle. But that said, since most of my riding, I'm a track racer, and most of my riding is in the drops, in a very crunched up, compacted position like this. The acute angle of my hip creates an opportunity for hip impingement. And what happens is, particularly with the shorter rider, and this is why Ken was a great influence to me and why he inspired me, is I'm 5'6", and most riders, I would say, under 5'8", again, depending on different morphological issues, probably have hip impingement, but don't realize it. And what it feels like is a pressure up here in your hip because the hip is binding up against your torso. If that's the best way for me to describe it. The great part is when you get rid of it, you no longer feel that pressure. And this is where the experimentation comes with. And when you experiment with the crank lengths, you do have to make some adjustments with saddle position. But that notwithstanding, and height position, that notwithstanding. And if you understand that, then you can make those adjustments yourself because you are literally, you know exactly how long of a distance you've shortened or lengthened the crank, and you can make the appropriate adjustments. But I digress. That person's comment kind of triggered me, by the way. It's that moment when the hip impingement goes away that the lights go off in your head. And you're like, oh my goodness. For me, at least that's the case. I've been dealing with hip impingement my entire life, but never knew it. And for me, of course, doing the stream, I went all the way. I went from 165s to 145s. There was a reason for that, is because I had my SRM cranks adapted, machined, and that was the shortest length that they could do it without making extensive work to the cranks. But anyway, go all the way, and I honestly did not experience any drop in my standing start ability, but the hip impingement went away. And here's the great thing is I've always had a problem with, let me see if I can adjust the camera, with heel drop. And the reason why I've always had a problem with heel drop, and this is me exaggerating, I'm dropping my heel at the bottom of my stroke, which you should not be doing, because you're overusing your calf, but also at the bottom of your stroke, that's when your leg should be fully extended. But by dropping your heel, now you've hyperextended your leg. But that said, I always had a problem with heel dropping, and to the point where a friend of mine, Todd, noticed it when I posted a video of me riding rollers, of me dropping my heel. I think it was the rollers. But it's when I shortened my cranks that heel dropping disappeared. And the reason why I had the heel drop was because I was having this binding up in my hip, and the crank was too long. In order to compensate, to get around that extra length, I was dropping my heel to kind of scrape the crank around. And this is one of these things where you just got used to it, because I was doing it for so long. And you won't know that you have the problem until it goes away. And the other thing that I describe it, or compare it to, is, this is a great example, cutout saddles. My favorite saddle through the 90s, right? It was through the 90s? Yeah, that's when I was racing, was the Physique Arione saddle. Anyone that could still ride that, props to you and your prostate. But if you don't know what it is, it's a classic racing saddle of the last modern era before cutout saddles became a thing. But it's just a relatively flat saddle, a long saddle, no anatomical considerations to be made. It just looks sleek, gave you a great place for you to slide around on the saddle if you're a racer, because if you wanted to get in different positions. But that said, it was like one of the most popular saddles of that era, and I didn't know I had soft tissue issues. I've had body geometry saddles. No, that's how I found out. So what happened was body geometry by such Specialized was becoming a thing, and they were the pioneers of Dr. Minkow, of cutout saddles to relieve that pressure on your prostate. And it's not until I didn't know I had a problem, but I had read about these saddles and, okay, well, this is the newest, greatest thing. Let me try it out. And when I tried it, I'm like, oh, now I know what that problem is. And it's actually when I switched, not necessarily from the body geometry, I think it was when I went to a Roman saddle. And that's when I realized, like, oh my goodness, I've had a problem for quite a while, because the Roman was a longer mountain bike saddle that was just more traditional looking from the side, but had a cutout. And that's when I realized, like, oh my goodness, I've had a problem for quite a while. I just didn't know it. And it's just one of these things where you've just dealt with it because you just thought that's what it feels like to ride a bike. Just like having pressure on your palms, being normal, having just kind of a tension in your neck here. I don't care how relaxed you are riding, you're still gonna have tension in your neck. Well, that's normal. And these are things that you just assumed were part of riding bike until you no longer have them and made adjustments to get rid of them. And that they were actually a byproduct of something that wasn't right. And that's crank length. And here's the thing is the person asked me what my inseam was of my legs. And that really doesn't matter relative to all these other factors that go into it. But you have to experiment with your crank length in order to find out whether or not you actually have hip impingement, or if you can benefit from relieving that. Some people don't. If you sit up at a more of an upright position, you probably really don't need to deal with crank length. It's only in the extremes when you're doing stuff like I'm doing and trying to squeeze out every single freaking watt possible. And or you're doing it for long rides in those positions, and you just want to be able to be efficient. But like I said, the more you have an acute hip angle, the more hip impingement is going to become an issue. So as far as I know, most bike fitters don't have access to like an old Serrata cycle, a retool made one, and it totally slips my mind. They're all out of business now. But it was one of the biggest digital bike fitting systems, and they went out of business. But they had a really cool one that was, you can adjust it infinite angles as far, and it was motorized and everything else. And but most fitters don't have that capability. And most people, when they get a bike fit, they want to ride their own bike, because especially if you're a time trialist, where hip impingement is going to be absolutely a huge factor. So unfortunately, you're not going to know you have hip impingement at a bike fitter. They might be able to spot it, but they're not going to be able to do anything about it on the spot. And bike fitters can chime in on this and flame me. But I've talked to other bike fitters, and sure, they know about hip impingement, but how they would remediate that on the spot without cranks, or even actually find the sweet spot, I have no idea how you would do that, or how you even be able to begin to spot it. I mean, maybe you could see a little bit of hitch, but that'll give you that'd be a gross adjustment, and not give you the fine tuning where you're trying to truly optimize what I was saying, to get maximum length of the crank for torque purposes, but reduce the length enough so you don't have hip impingement. So anyway, that's a long rant. Thanks for watching, and talk to you soon.